Get him out of my sight, he's obsolete. Those were the last words Luis Alvarez heard before he was fired in front of the entire company. A 62-year-old mechanic with grease on his hands and genius in his silence thrown out without a second thought. But what the arrogant CEO didn't know was that Luis had just uncovered a fatal flaw in their most important prototype. And when that engine roared, his absence would speak louder than any headline. What followed was a storm of redemption revolution and a man's quiet rise to become the soul of a company that once discarded him. Now, before we dive deeper, please subscribe to our channel. We share powerful, meaningful stories like this every day. And drop a comment below to let us know where you're watching from. Thank you so much, and now let's get back to the story. Get him out of my sight. He's a liability. The voice thundered across the pristine showroom floor, slicing through the morning hum of work like a blade. All movement froze. Eyes darted from monitor screens to the polished chrome of the luxury vehicle in the center of the room. The CEO, Derek Langston, didn't lower his voice. He didn't care who heard him. In fact, he wanted everyone to. Across from him, standing motionless beside a spotless white Vortex S9 prototype, was a man in a stained blue jumpsuit. His gloves were off, tucked respectfully into his back pocket. His hair, silver and combed back, shimmered under the LED lights. Luis Alvarez, head mechanic. 42 years in the company, a man who had built engines with his bare hands when the company still operated out of a converted garage, stood without speaking. "You think I've got time to babysit dinosaurs?" Derek scoffed, walking in calculated strides, shoes clicking like gunshots. "You were supposed to be gone months ago. I let you stay out of pity, and now I find you under the hood of a prototype with no clearance." Luis opened his mouth, then closed it. His throat tightened. Not from shame, he'd long outgrown that, but from the bitter taste of history repeating itself. He had seen this before. Suits who came in with jargon and spreadsheets, who never touched a wrench yet acted like gods. The difference now was, this time there was no one left to vouch for him. His allies had retired, been pushed out, or learned to keep their heads down. Derek didn't wait for an answer. He turned to the crowd of employees standing awkwardly along the wall, young engineers, marketing assistants, logistics staff, and interns who had idolized Luis even if they never dared say it aloud. "Let this be a lesson," Derek declared, lifting a hand toward the exit. "This company is about vision. It's about speed, scale, and disruption, not outdated, oil-stained intuition." The silence was heavy. Someone cleared their throat. A nervous intern dropped a wrench that clattered on the tile like a gunshot. Still, Luis said nothing. Not because he didn't have words, but because in moments like this, words weren't meant to be said. They were meant to be earned. He looked one last time at the prototype. Its hood was still slightly open, the internal wiring just visible beneath the sleek exterior. And in that moment, Luis's eyes didn't just see the car, they saw the miscalibration in the AI-integrated fuel feedback loop. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. But if left unaddressed, it could cause the engine to oversaturate and combust at high velocity. Luis didn't move to speak. He'd seen what happened when he tried. Instead, he walked toward the back locker, each step echoing like a farewell. He passed the younger techs who couldn't meet his eyes. One of them, Aria, a software assistant, did. Her jaw clenched. Her lips trembled like she wanted to say something, but her gaze dropped as Luis passed. In the locker room, he packed his things slowly. He'd been here long before the chrome was polished, before the walls were white and sterile, before investor money had flooded in and replaced trust with quarterly targets. The scent of metal and engine oil still clung to his hands. He didn't wash it off. It was the last honest thing about the building. When he walked out the back door, no one followed. No one, except the wind that drifted through the automatic glass doors and stirred the blueprint that had fallen out of his folder onto the floor. Back in the showroom, Derek adjusted his collar and turned to the gathered employees. "Now then," he said coolly, "let's focus on what matters. Tonight the world meets the Vortex S9, and I intend to make it unforgettable." He didn't realize how true those words would be. Near the design lab, Arya picked up the fallen page. It was dense with notes, mathematical notations, mechanical stress diagrams, and a single circled phrase: fuel loop compression, faulty rebound risk, above 4,700 RPM, immediate correction required. Beneath that, Luis's neat signature, dated just this morning. Her hand trembled. She looked toward the display room where Derek was posing beside the prototype for the press team's test shots. The car gleamed under the lights. Sleek. Deadly. She tucked the page into her jacket and whispered to herself, "He wasn't trying to fix it for himself. He was trying to save us." Outside, Luis stepped into the sunlight. It was a beautiful day. A little too beautiful for what had just happened. The parking lot shimmered in the heat. A few feet from his truck, he paused and turned just for a second to look back at the building that had been his life. He didn't know that inside the heart of his warning was already starting to pulse. Not in the car. Not yet. But in the minds of those who had watched. Especially one. And in just a few hours, Luis Alvarez, the man dismissed as obsolete, would redefine everything this company thought it knew about genius. The wind carried the hum of distant city traffic as Luis Alvarez turned the key to his old pickup. The engine grumbled like a tired friend waking from a long nap. He didn't drive away just yet. Instead, he sat still, hands resting on the wheel, watching the building he had helped shape over 4 decades now, as foreign to him as a stranger's house. Inside that showroom, he'd spent more years than some of those engineers had been alive. Each corner of that space held echoes of his sweat and problem-solving. He'd once rebuilt an entire drivetrain using scraps and instinct during a manufacturing delay. That car won an innovation award 2 years later. No one remembered who had rebuilt it in the dark with a flashlight in his mouth and a busted ankle. But Luis did. He exhaled. Not bitterness, just the kind of grief that doesn't look like sadness, but instead feels like being slowly unwritten. He was about to shift into gear when he saw movement through the showroom glass. Arya, the young software assistant, stood holding a tablet and Luis's annotated blueprint. Her brows were knit tight in concentration, lips slightly parted. She was reading, not glancing, not skimming, reading. Her eyes traced every calculation he'd jotted down in haste but precision. Luis watched her for just a second longer, then nodded once to no one in particular. Then he drove away, the gravel crunching under his tires, the only applause for his quiet exit. Back inside, Arya felt something twist in her gut. A tremor of unease, a whisper that wouldn't silence. She walked briskly to the development bay where the prototype was stationed. Its hood had been lowered again, sealed for presentation. No one was allowed to touch it now, not without authorization from Derek himself. But Arya wasn't thinking about protocol anymore. She ducked into her side office and placed the blueprint on her desk. Luis's notes weren't guesswork. They were surgical observations made with the eyes of someone who understood machines the way a composer understands sound, not with data, but with instinct, sharpened by years of immersion. She pulled up the car's diagnostics. The AI system showed green. The numbers looked fine. Everything appeared average. But Luis hadn't written those warnings based on what the system was showing. He had predicted what it wasn't catching. Arya stared at one line in his notes. Feedback delay at high throttle equals ghost surge. Danger starts at 4725 RPM. It was a level the demo engine would hit. Exactly. The prototype was set to rev up to 4800 for the audience. That was the moment they wanted to show off. She felt a cold weight settle in her chest. What if he was right? She checked the logs. She cross-referenced builds. She ran simulations. Then she found it. Buried under 3 code layers, the AI was smoothing over a spike in data at 4720 RPM. The feedback loop was muting the anomaly, not correcting it, hiding it. The system, proud of its efficiency, thought it was helping. In truth, it was paving the way for combustion failure. Her mouth went dry. She looked again at Luis's page. Ghost surge. She was holding a ghost that could kill the car, and the company's reputation in front of a dozen billion-dollar investors that evening. And the only person who had seen it had just been thrown out like yesterday's trash. She bolted. Down the corridor, past the lunchroom, past marketing, past HR. She nearly collided with a janitor, murmured a breathless apology, and kept running until she reached the test bay doors. She scanned her badge. Access denied. She swore under her breath, then sprinted toward the second floor where she knew they hadn't changed the override access code for the emergency maintenance panel. Back in the control room, Derek was rehearsing his pitch. This car doesn't just drive. It learns you. It becomes an extension of your identity. He adjusted his cufflinks as a cameraman gave him a thumbs up. You know what makes us different? We don't follow trends. We invent the future. Outside the bay, Arya slammed the emergency override. A soft alarm sounded, a non-emergency system breach alert. Derek's comms lit up. What the hell is that? He barked. Looks like someone's overriding security in Bay 2, a coordinator said. Get security, now. Inside the test bay, Arya was already under the hood, hands shaking as she pulled the main power relay from the engine's AI ignition. The car dimmed. The lights died. The showroom buzz faded like a stunned gasp. She stepped back, heart pounding. Footsteps stormed behind her. Arya! Derek's voice exploded like a shotgun blast. He was flanked by two guards, both equally confused. You just cost us a $50 million launch window. Are you out of your mind? She didn't back down. She held out Luis's paper like a shield. This engine would have failed at 4725 RPM. It's ghost looping data in the AI system. It looks safe, but it's not. If you'd listened to him instead of humiliating him in front of everyone, you'd know that. Derek froze. One of the guards frowned. Ghost looping. Arya stepped forward. The AI thinks it's helping, but it's actually suppressing warning surges. The engine would have oversaturated, probably wouldn't blow during the demo, but a few weeks on the road, a customer driving their family at high speed. She didn't have to finish. Derek's jaw tightened. You better pray you're wrong. I'm not, she said, voice low. And you know it. Behind them, silence had gathered. Employees, engineers, designers, all had followed the noise, and now they watched their CEO stand speechless before the assistant he'd never remembered hiring, holding the technical notes of a man he had just publicly dismissed. Derek snatched the page and stormed off without a word. The guards lowered their arms. One of them gave Arya a nod. Good catch, he murmured. She didn't feel victorious. Not yet. Not while Luis was out there walking away from everything he'd built, not knowing he'd just saved it. Arya returned to her desk and wrote a company-wide memo attaching the corrected report. Then with a breath, she clicked Reply All to the original email thread where Derek had approved the prototype. Subject line, correction submitted by Luis Alvarez. Please review immediately. The storm hadn't broken yet, but it was coming. The sun dipped lower over the skyline, stretching shadows across the glass façade of Langston Motors. The grand launch was set for 7 o'clock sharp, and the showroom gleamed like a cathedral, pristine, polished, overproduced. Outside, velvet ropes were strung, security-briefed champagne chilled. Inside, the prototype, newly silenced, quickly patched, and nervously rechecked, rested on the raised dais like a crown jewel. But for all the glamour, the tension inside the walls was electric. Derek Langston stood in the executive lounge with a tumbler of bourbon in hand, staring out at the crowd assembling on the street. A parade of investors, tech influencers, and media elites filtered in under the glow of branded spotlights. Flashbulbs flickered. The Langston Motors emblem spun slowly on a giant LED screen. Behind him, his chief operations officer spoke carefully, the way one speaks to a ticking bomb. Sir, the board saw the diagnostic memo Arya sent. Derek's grip on the glass tightened. And they want to meet. Tomorrow morning, 8 a.m. sharp. His jaw tensed. Then let's make tonight flawless. Arya, meanwhile, was nowhere near the spotlight. She stood in the tech booth near the back of the room, watching the monitors cycle through the event sequence. Her palms were still slick with adrenaline. Luis's notes were folded in her pocket, worn at the edges from her constant fidgeting. No one had spoken about reinstating him. No one had even mentioned his name on the internal channels since the memo. But that silence, pregnant, restrained, said everything. It wasn't denial. It was fear. She kept refreshing the safety logs. Still stable. The fix had been implemented, but the unease inside her didn't come from the car. It came from knowing a good man had walked away from the world he gave everything to, carrying a heartbreak no applause could ever repair. Back in a modest apartment, 20 minutes from the launch site, Luis sat alone at his kitchen table, the familiar hum of the old ceiling fan whirring above. A cup of black coffee steamed beside his elbow untouched. His hands, calloused, nicked with tiny scars earned over years, held an old photograph. It was a faded shot from 1991. A younger Luis stood beside the very first Langston prototype, beaming with grease-smeared pride. Next to him was the company's founder, Henry Langston, Derek's father. They had built that machine together, in a rented warehouse, with parts scrounged from 3 junkyards and a prayer. Henry had always listened, always asked questions. He used to say, "The smartest guy in the room isn't the one who talks the most. It's the one who knows when to stay quiet and watch the engine breathe." Derek didn't inherit that wisdom. The news segment flickered on the muted TV in the corner, a broadcast from the launch showing guests arriving in luxury cars, shaking hands with PR staff, snapping selfies beside the Vortex S9. Luis leaned forward and turned the volume up. Langston Motors debuting what they call a revolutionary AI-integrated vehicle tonight. But behind the scenes, a recent leak suggests there were last-minute changes to the prototype due to a critical safety flaw identified by a veteran mechanic that employee sources say was terminated hours before the event. Luis's breath caught. The anchor continued. While the company has made no formal statement, an internal memo credited to Luis Alvarez was circulated across engineering departments. Industry experts are already praising the catch as a life-saving stroke of genius. He stared at the screen. It wasn't vindication he felt. It was quiet sorrow. Not for himself, but for how quickly people forget the hands that build the future, until those hands are gone. At that very moment in the Langston showroom, the event was beginning. A spotlight cut through the space. Derek strode on stage, smiling as though none of the day's chaos had touched him. "Good evening, visionaries," he said, his voice a calm mask over restless nerves. "Tonight, we unveil more than a car. We unveil the next chapter of motion, memory, and machine." Polite applause followed. Behind the glass curtain in the tech booth, Arya watched him speak. Her jaw clenched. She could feel it. The air in the room was holding its breath. Not just from awe, but from uncertainty. They didn't know what they were about to see. Not truly. When the moment came, a technician handed Derek a sleek silver keycard. He turned dramatically toward the car and slid the card into the ignition port. The vehicle hummed to life. Lights danced across its body. Its LED display flashed the company logo, then a soft blue interface reading, "Initializing AI sync." The room exhaled. The engine growled. And then, nothing exploded. No surge. No stall, no smoke. The fix had worked. Cheers broke out. Applause thundered. Investors exchanged satisfied nods. Glasses clinked. But Derek's smile faltered as one of the engineering leads leaned toward him mid-cheer and whispered something in his ear. The CEO's face blanched. His eyes locked on the crowd, scanning for Arya. She stood calmly in the back, arms folded, watching everything with unreadable expression. He turned away from the podium, waving the cameras off, and stormed into the wings. That whisper, it had told him the truth was out. Investors had seen the memo. Tech blogs had picked it up. And his role in firing the man who'd saved the company's most valuable prototype was now being questioned on every corner of the internet. In the shadows of the now glorious launch, a reckoning had begun. And far from the lights, Luis Alvarez sat quietly unaware that across the city, people were now saying his name with reverence. He didn't need applause. but it was coming for him anyway. The clock struck midnight before the showroom began to empty. Champagne glasses stood half-finished on end tables, lipsticked and forgotten. Outside, the clamor of departing luxury vehicles echoed off marble steps and shuttered glass doors. But inside, behind the executive corridor, there was no music, no laughter, only the sterile hum of silence. Derek Langston sat alone in his office staring at the live feed from the PR war room. On the screen, half a dozen junior staffers were frantically responding to media inquiries, typing out prepared statements, rewriting press releases with trembling hands. The headlines were spreading like wildfire. Veteran mechanics warning saves Vortex S9 from catastrophic failure. Langston CEO under fire after dismissing genius behind critical discovery. Whistleblower memo from fired employee Sparks Board review. Derek's hand tightened into a fist. He clicked off the screen. He hated the word whistleblower. He hated that Luis was now a trending name when 24 hours earlier Derek had considered him disposable. There was a knock. He didn't answer. The door opened anyway. Arya stepped in calm, her badge clipped to her belt like a line in the sand. He looked up. "If you're here to gloat, I'm not." She walked slowly across the carpet, placing a small folder on his desk. He looked down at it, Luis's notes reprinted and neatly bound. "What is this supposed to be, a victory lap?" "It's the truth," she replied. "In your hands, again." He exhaled slowly, rage curling under his breath like steam. "You had no right to override my decisions today." She didn't blink. "I had every right. If I hadn't, someone could have died. And you know it." His eyes flared. "I made a call." "No," she said gently. "You made a statement. You wanted to make an example out of him, because his silence threatened your authority. Because you couldn't understand how someone with dirty hands could see clearer than your engineers." That silence again, dense, unmoving. "You know what scares me most," she added, "that if the car had blown up, you'd still have blamed him, even though he tried to warn us." Derek stood slowly looming over her. "Careful," he warned. Arya met his stare. "No, you be careful, because the board is watching, the investors are watching, the internet is watching, and they're all asking the same question. Why was the smartest man in your company the only one not in the room tonight?" She turned to leave, then paused at the door. "He still doesn't know," she added. "He has no idea the world's starting to wake up." The door clicked shut behind her. Miles away, Luis was up early. He always was. The ritual of morning was a meditation, steel-cut oats, half an apple black coffee sunrise bleeding through blinds. But this morning his phone didn't stop buzzing. It started small, a missed call from Javier, an old coworker from the machine shop days. Then a text from his niece. "T.O., you're on the news." Then more calls, emails, mentions. His inbox lit up like a pinball machine. And when he finally switched on the TV, there it was, his name, his face decades younger on a screen beside the headline, "Retired Mechanic Saves Luxury Launch Called a Quiet Genius by Engineering Community." He sat there, unmoving, phone vibrating endlessly on the table. Luis Alvarez, once dismissed by Langston Motors earlier this week, is now being hailed as the architect behind the Vortex S9's recovery. Internal sources confirm his handwritten memo identified a flaw missed by the vehicle's AI, preventing what could have been a devastating failure at last night's showcase. The news anchor's voice faded behind the rush of memory. He remembered the first time someone handed him a wrench. He remembered his father's hands, showing him how to listen, not just look at the rhythm of a machine, how to feel it, hear it, understand when it breathed wrong. That was a language he had spoken for a lifetime. And now suddenly the world seemed to remember it existed. His phone buzzed again. Unknown number. He picked up. "Mr. Alvarez?" The voice was smooth, practiced. "This is Ellen Tran. I'm the chair of the Langston Motors Board. I was hoping we could meet. Today." Luis blinked. "Meet? Yes, in person. We owe you a conversation, and possibly an apology." Luis didn't answer immediately. He looked out the window at the breaking light. "Where?" he asked softly. "Conference room A, headquarters, 10 a.m. I'll be there." He hung up. He stood slowly. Every joint in his body remembered his years, but something deeper moved inside him, something old but sharp, something like dignity rising from where it had been buried. At 9:52 a.m., Luis Alvarez walked into the building he had once called home. No jumpsuit, no toolbox. He wore a crisp shirt, worn jeans, and a look in his eyes that turned every passing head. No one said a word. No one needed to. When he reached the boardroom, Ellen stood to greet him. Behind her, a half-dozen directors straightened their postures. Even Derek, standing awkwardly at the end of the table, looked, if only briefly, like a man out of armor. "Mr. Alvarez," Ellen said, gesturing to a seat. "Thank you for coming." He took it slowly, folding his hands on the table. His eyes swept across the room. Not accusing, not boastful, just present, unshaken. "I believe," Ellen continued, "we owe you more than thanks. Your intervention saved not only the vortex, but likely the entire future of this company. You saw what our systems didn't, what our people missed." Derek cleared his throat. "I misjudged." Luis didn't flinch. "You dismissed," he said quietly, without listening. "That's different." A pause. Ellen leaned forward. "We'd like to offer you a position, not as a mechanic, but as a strategic advisor, chief of technical mentorship. You would train our next generation of engineers, and if you accept, you'll do it your way." Luis didn't smile. Not yet. He simply nodded once. And just like that, the man they had forgotten became the man they would follow. The conference room emptied slowly, as if no one wanted to be the first to break the spell. Luis remained seated, even after the formal offer had been extended, after the directors had voiced their support, and Derek Langston had lowered his head and offered a stiff, soulless apology. Luis wasn't moved by theatrics. He never had been. He measured sincerity not by the words spoken, but by the weight of silence after them. Now, with only Ellen Tran still in the room, Luis gazed out the floor-to-ceiling window behind her, watching the morning sunlight strike the metal edge of the prototype garage far below. It gleamed, proud, sleek, and empty. And for the first time in weeks, Luis felt something like peace begin to settle along the edges of his ribs. Ellen broke the quiet. "You could have walked away. No one would have blamed you." "I did walk away," Luis said. "But truth follows, doesn't it?" She folded her hands. "It does when it's written in fuel lines and circuit boards, and when it saves lives." Luis slowly stood. "I'm not here for redemption. I'm here for the kids like Arya, for the engineers who know something's wrong but are too scared to speak because the suits say silence is safer." Her eyes didn't waver. "Then you're exactly who we need." As Luis left the boardroom, passing staff in crisp shirts and quiet awe, the energy had changed. There were no more side glances, no more turned shoulders, only reverent silence, the kind given to survivors who walked through fire and came back holding blueprints. 2 hours later, he was standing in the design bay once again, this time not as a mechanic but as a leader. The space had been prepared for him, a modest workbench, a digital wall of live diagnostics, a mentorship corner with a sign that read, "Luis Alvarez Innovation Lab." The company's PR team had insisted on the name. He hadn't asked for it, would have preferred something simpler. But when he stepped through the doors and every young engineer lifted their heads, the silence that met him was not forced. It was full of hope. Arya stood among them, her arms crossed, trying not to beam too obviously. He nodded to her. "You kept the paper," he said. "I kept the truth," she answered. Luis took his place at the front. No microphone, no speech, just a quiet breath and a single question. "What do you think the machine feels when it stalls?" Murmurs passed through the room. One young man, barely 22, raised his hand hesitantly. "It doesn't feel. It's mechanical." Luis nodded. "That's what I used to think too. Until I realized the stall isn't the machine breaking. It's the machine warning us. It's not failure. It's communication. He walked over to the prototype's stripped engine and ran his fingers along the exposed edge. We've stopped listening. We stare at screens, wait for green lights. But engines still whisper. Machines still breathe. And if you learn to hear that rhythm, you'll build things that don't just work, they live. No one spoke. But every eye held the same fire they were ready to learn. As the day unfolded, Luis moved from station to station, eyes sharp but gentle, correcting torque sequences, testing balance in modified transmissions, walking a young designer through the elegant simplicity of a cross-flow cylinder head. He never condescended. He never rushed. He watched, waited, and when the time was right, offered the kind of wisdom only forged by decades of silence and steel. News cameras caught wind of his return. A reporter tried to barge into the garage for an exclusive. Luis declined the interview. "I'm not the story," he said. "The story is every overlooked mind, waiting for a chance to speak." Still, the company's social media exploded. Luis Alvarez, mechanic to mentor. True engineer memes circulated photos of him in his oil-stained jumpsuit beside his new badge that read, Chief of Technical Mentorship. But Luis never checked the tags. He was too busy doing what he'd always done, fixing what others thought was unfixable. By week's end, the Vortex S9 passed third-party stress tests with flying colors. The board's confidence returned. Investors who had considered pulling out now requested exclusive previews of Luis's notes for future models. The lab became a hub of innovation. But it also became something rarer, a place where mistakes weren't punishable but examined, where questions weren't career-ending, but conversation-starting, where Luis's quiet, deliberate guidance rewrote not just the car's code, but the company's culture. One afternoon, Arya found him tinkering with a simplified gear model made from wood and old bolts. "You've got a team of AI modelers and $1 million simulator," she teased. "And you're building a transmission with a hammer." Luis smiled faintly. "This teaches patience. Computers teach speed. But this," he said, holding up the imperfect mechanism, "teaches rhythm. And rhythm is how machines speak." She stared at the model. "It's beautiful. Imperfect, but beautiful. Just like people," he murmured. Then more seriously, "They'll come for you one day, Arya. Someone in a suit will tell you your instinct is a liability, that you talk too much, ask too many questions. When that day comes, don't fold. Speak louder." She swallowed hard. "I will." Luis glanced around the room, now alive with the sound of tools, conversation, collaboration. "Good," he said, "because this isn't about me. It never was. It's about what outlives us." That night, as the lights dimmed in the garage and the team packed up for the weekend, Luis stayed behind. He sat at his old workbench, now reborn with polished steel and touchscreen tools, and opened a notebook. Not digital, not corporate issued, just paper. At the top of the first page, he wrote, "Machines have memory, so do we. Let's teach them both how to speak again." He closed the book, exhaled, and allowed himself finally to smile. Not because he had proven anything, but because he had preserved something: truth, dignity, and the voice of the quiet genius that lives in all of us, waiting to be heard. 2 weeks later, the Vortex S9 rolled off the private production line in silent triumph. Every component bore the subtle fingerprint of recalibration, a whisper of insight from a man who once stood in shadows and silence. The launch had turned from a disaster in waiting to a masterclass in humility, ingenuity, and redemption. But for Luis, none of that mattered. What mattered was what came next. His return had reshaped the company's rhythm, and yet the work was just beginning. Luis had long believed that machines and people shared one tragic similarity: both broke when ignored too long. But under the right hands, they could be made whole again. This belief shaped everything he touched now. His lab had grown from a quiet corner to a heartbeat, a place where employees came not just to fix machines, but to understand them. Not just to engineer, but to ask. Luis taught with patience, but also with precision. He wasn't a preacher. He was a craftsman passing down something holy. One Thursday morning, Arya brought a problem no one else could solve. The newest prototype, an experimental hydrogen-electric hybrid, had a persistent hum, barely audible, inconsistent, and maddening. No error code, no AI alert, but the hum was real, and it made every engineer on the floor uneasy. Luis listened once, then twice, then asked everyone to leave the room. When the door closed, he knelt beside the chassis, placed one hand on the frame, and closed his eyes. He tilted his head like a pianist, listening for a note out of tune. Then after a minute, he smiled. "There you are," he whispered. Later, he showed Arya what he'd found, a misaligned weight distribution between the front left motor mount and the lateral stabilizer. It was so minor the AI read it as background noise. But under full acceleration, it would have created a vibration that shortened battery life by 23%. "It's not broken," he told her. "It's just imbalanced, like everything at the start." Word of the fix spread like wildfire. Not because it was dramatic, but because it confirmed what had become legend. Luis didn't need screens to diagnose a problem. He could feel the soul of a machine before it even spoke. Employees began requesting sessions with him, not just for designs, but for mentorship. One by one, the people the company once overlooked began to find their voices. An intern who'd been silenced in meetings began leading her own design sprints. A technician who barely graduated from trade school submitted a patent for a modular cooling system. Luis encouraged every one of them, and he never let them forget, what you know matters, what you feel matters more. Outside the walls of Langston Motors, the world had also taken notice. Luis began receiving letters, handwritten ones, from retired mechanics community college students and high school shop teachers. They'd seen his story, and they saw in him what they hoped still had value: humility without weakness, knowledge without ego. One letter came from a small auto school in New Mexico. The principal wrote, "Our students have watched your story 10 times over. They've memorized your quote about rhythm. We have no budget, but if you ever pass through, we'd be honored if you spoke to them, even for 5 minutes." Luis folded the letter gently, placed it in a drawer, and mailed back a reply the same day. "Tell them I'll stay for an hour, maybe 2, tools in hand." Back in the city, something unexpected began to unfold. Derek Langston, once invincible behind polished glass and arrogant charm, was unraveling in quiet increments. He had not been fired yet, but the board had clipped his wings. His press appearances were canceled. His name was conspicuously absent from the next 2 product announcements. He still held the title of CEO, but the building no longer bent around him. He watched from the sidelines as Luis's lab became the epicenter of not just innovation, but integrity. And one evening, long after the building had gone quiet, he found himself standing outside the lab door. He didn't knock, just stared through the glass. Luis was alone at his bench, carefully cleaning a carburetor from a vintage 1976 Vega, a personal project he'd unearthed from storage. He didn't look up, but he knew who stood there. Finally, he spoke without turning. "You didn't come to talk about engines." Derek slowly pushed open the door. "No," he said. "I didn't." He took a step inside, the weight of ego for once not enough to carry him. "I came because I think I've forgotten what it means to build something." Luis said nothing. "I thought building meant raising numbers, launching faster, outselling competitors. I thought silence meant weakness, and I thought people like you were obstacles." Luis looked up. "And now," Derek swallowed, "now I know that when I fired you, I fired the last piece of my father's legacy I didn't understand." Luis set down the part he was cleaning and finally turned to face him. "You didn't fire me, Derek," he said calmly. "You revealed yourself. And sometimes that's more important. Derek didn't respond. Not because he didn't have anything to say, but because for the first time in years, he was listening. "I don't want your seat," Luis added. "But if you want to find your way back, start by leaving it empty for a while. Come down here, build something, get grease under your nails, learn again." A long pause. "I don't know if I remember how," Derek confessed. Luis picked up the carburetor and handed it to him. "Then start here." That night the CEO sat beside the man he once called obsolete, in silence, relearning the language of rhythm and mistakes and redemption. It wasn't a reconciliation, not yet, but it was the first honest conversation they'd ever had. And maybe in the whisper of turning gears and slow breath of repair something had finally shifted, not in the car, but in the company's soul. By the following month, the scent of transformation no longer lingered in the air. It had taken root. Langston Motors, once rigid with hierarchy and hushed by corporate arrogance, now moved to a gentler rhythm. Less about speed, more about direction. And at its center was a man who never once asked to lead, yet whose presence made people walk straighter, think deeper, and speak with care. Luis Alvarez didn't wear a title on his chest. He didn't need to. His authority radiated not from position, but from presence. His mentorship lab now hosted weekly open-floor workshops where no one stood at the head. Everyone circled, everyone contributed. Ideas were not filtered by status, but by sincerity. It was during one of these sessions that the conversation turned. A junior engineer, Sasha, barely 25, asked a question that froze the room. "How do we know we're building something good?" Luis didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked down at the gear assembly they'd been prototyping together. He ran a finger over the jagged edge of an unfinished spline, then quietly asked, "What does good mean to you?" Sasha hesitated. "Efficient, popular, fast." "No," Luis said with the softness of someone revealing a secret. "Those are outcomes. But good. Good is when something serves with dignity, when it honors the hands that built it, when it listens to the people who will live with it every day." A hush fell. Even Arya, who had heard him speak many times, felt her throat tighten. Luis continued. "A machine doesn't care how fast it goes. It cares how long it lasts, how it treats those it carries. That's what separates brilliance from noise." Afterward, no one left in a hurry. They lingered in the lab, rearranging tools, rechecking blueprints. Not because they were told to, but because the work felt sacred again. Later that evening, after the lights dimmed and most had gone home, Arya remained. She found Luis sitting near the old drafting table, sketching a strange hybrid of a rotary engine fused with modular battery units. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said, her voice almost a whisper. Luis looked up, eyes kind. "Of course." "Why did you come back?" He sat back, pen lowering. "I wasn't sure I would. I thought about walking away, starting a repair shop in the mountains, teaching high school kids how to listen to engines. So what changed?" He looked at her eyes, deep, like worn leather, carved with the weight of a lifetime. "I saw you." Her breath caught. "You saw me," she echoed. "The way you ran to that engine. The way you chose truth over fear. You reminded me who I used to be before the noise got too loud. You reminded me that not all fires are put out. Some are passed on." Arya lowered her gaze, not from shame, but from the sheer weight of honor. "And I realized," Luis continued, "if I walk away now, that fire might fade. But if I stay, maybe it spreads." From that night on, Luis and Arya became something like co-guardians of the company's conscience. One seasoned by time and heartbreak. The other sharpened by courage and clarity. Together, they became the quiet force behind Langston Motors' rebirth. Yet outside the walls of innovation, storm clouds gathered. The corporate world did not forgive transformation easily. Rival firms began circulating whispers. Langston's gone soft. They mocked the mentorship model. Critics sneered at the idea of a 62-year-old mechanic shaping next-gen vehicle AI. One morning, a viral op-ed appeared in a major autotech blog. Sentimental engineering is not strategy. Langston's new wisdom culture may cost them everything. Derek Langston read the article with a stony face. He was no longer center stage. That space had shifted, but he wasn't jealous. Not anymore. What he felt was protective. He walked down to the lab unannounced. No guards, no tie. Just an open collar and a look in his eyes that had not been there a month ago. Luis was showing two interns how to interpret vibration signatures in analog dashboards. Derek waited until the session ended, then pulled him aside. "I want to say something," he began. Luis raised a brow. "I used to think leadership meant standing above everyone else, being the loudest in the room, but watching you has taught me that real leadership is listening until someone else finds their voice." Luis said nothing. He simply waited. Derek took a breath. "I want to make something right, not as CEO, as a man." Luis tilted his head. "Go on." "I've asked the board to fund a new initiative. It'll be called the Alvarez Fellowship. Full scholarships for students from underserved communities to study engineering design and mentorship under your program. No strings, just access, just a door." For a moment, Luis didn't move. Then slowly, he extended his hand. Derek took it. No cameras, no press release. Just a handshake between two men who had once stood on opposite ends of silence and now stood together in the space between understanding and legacy. The Alvarez Fellowship was announced quietly, but the impact was immediate. Letters poured in. Applications from places most elite firms had never bothered to look: small towns, inner cities, tribal reservations, rural schools with no formal STEM programs. Kids who had never touched a 3D printer but could fix a tractor with a socket wrench and a soda can. Luis read every single one, and when he held those letters in his hands, he didn't see desperation. He saw himself, and he smiled, because the future wasn't just coming, it was knocking. And this time someone had left the door open. Fall arrived like a quiet apology-brisk wind sweeping golden leaves into circles outside Langston Motors' gleaming campus. The courtyard, once rigid with formality, had softened. There were benches now where young engineers sat between shifts, sketching ideas in worn notebooks, or trading thoughts over lukewarm coffee. You could hear laughter now. You could feel breath returning to a company once choked by ambition. And on the third floor in the heart of the building, the Alvarez Fellowship launched its first official cohort. 20 students, 20 stories, none of them polished. Some arrived in thrift store coats, carrying nothing but a dog-eared R, Sum, and Fire in their chest. One boy had never left his hometown before. Another had been repairing his uncle's motorcycle since she was 9. A girl from Baltimore brought sketches of engines made from scrap drawn on the backs of cereal boxes. They were raw. They were imperfect. And Luis Alvarez stood before them, with no podium, no title embroidered into his shirt, just rolled up sleeves, oil on his palms, and a glint in his eye that said, "I see you." "I'm not here to test you," he told them. "You've already passed the hardest one, convincing yourselves you deserve to be in this room." A boy in the back wiped his eyes quickly. Luis walked slowly past them, fingers trailing across a rack of tools. "Here, we don't chase perfection. We chase understanding. We listen to the machines, to each other, and to ourselves. That's how you build something that matters." He paused. Then he picked up a worn wrench and placed it in the center of the work table. "Lesson 1, he said. "Every tool tells a story. Every scar, every dent, every scratch, it's proof that someone tried. I'd rather see a scratched tool than a perfect one that never touched a bolt." That was how it began. Every morning the fellowship gathered with him, not to be lectured, but to build. They constructed more than engines. They reconstructed belief. Luis taught them things no textbook could. That the hum of an engine tells you how hard it's working. That torque isn't just force, it's negotiation. That leadership isn't volume, it's attention. He taught them how to see failure as feedback, how to feel when a gear didn't belong, how to trust the voice inside that said, check it again. Each week, one student presented a project, not for critique, but for conversation. The room didn't clap at the end, they stood. Always, out of respect. That tradition wasn't imposed. It happened once when a girl showed a water-powered cart she'd built for her disabled brother. After that, no one could sit still when someone shared something real. Outside the lab, the company watched with growing awe. Investors who had once scoffed at soft culture were now requesting visits to the fellowship floor. Articles began calling it the engine of empathy. Schools reached out for blueprints, and other firms began whispering about replicating the program, though none could replicate its soul. One day, Arya walked in holding a new schematic. She looked tired, but her eyes burned. "I think we can build a new modular suspension system for uneven terrain," she said. "Something adaptive. Something for places where roads are a luxury." Luis studied the sketch. "How soon?" he asked. "Depends on who we let lead it." Luis handed it to Sasha, the same young woman who once asked what good meant. "Congratulations," he said. "You're in charge." Sasha blinked. "Me." "You saw the need," he said, "and you asked the right question." With trembling hands, she took the blueprint and turned toward the cohort. "Then we build for the forgotten," she whispered. And that became their motto. The project evolved into a collaboration with nonprofits aimed at delivering low-cost, adaptable transport to disaster zones and underdeveloped communities. Every bolt was accounted for, every part logged, every hour earned. The Vortex Adaptive, as it would be called, wasn't flashy, but it was kind, and it carried stories in every weld. Meanwhile, Derek Langston remained mostly in the shadows. He no longer occupied the corner office. He'd asked for it to be repurposed into a collaborative hub for the fellowship. "I spent years looking out that window thinking I was leading," he said to Luis. "Turns out I was just admiring my reflection." He wasn't bitter. He was rebuilding. One evening he arrived at the lab unannounced, holding a box wrapped in brown paper. Luis was adjusting a motor rig when Derek cleared his throat. "I wanted to return something," he said. Luis raised a brow. Derek opened the box and lifted out a leather-bound notebook, weathered, cracked at the spine. Luis took a step closer. "I found this in a storage locker. It's your original engineering journal from '89. Your notes sketches engine designs. Even back then, your calculations were decades ahead of us." Luis touched the cover like it was a lost limb returned. "I wanted to throw it out," Derek admitted. "Years ago. I told myself it didn't matter. But when I opened it, I realized it was the blueprint I'd been missing all along." Luis looked him in the eye. "It wasn't the blueprint," he said gently. "It was the humility to read it." They stood in silence for a long time. Not awkward, not heavy. Just still, like the moment before ignition when the engine hasn't yet roared, but the energy is already alive beneath the hood. Then Luis reached into the box and pulled out a page. It was a simple sketch of a dual-core combustion model. Under it, a note in faded ink. "Machines remember. So should we." Luis handed it to Derek. "Frame it," he said. "Put it on the wall you used to stare at. Let it remind you." That night, Derek returned to the now shared space where his office once stood. He pinned the note above a whiteboard right next to a quote someone had scribbled in marker during a team meeting. "We don't build engines, we build trust." Outside, the city pulsed with noise and speed, but inside those walls something rare had been built. Not just a car, not just a program, but a place where wisdom mattered, where hands and hearts worked together, and where the man once cast aside without a second thought had become the quiet architect of a revolution. Winter crept in on soft footsteps. Early shadows fogged glass, the subtle scent of pine drifting in from the city outskirts.
But inside the Alvarez lab, warmth never left.
The walls pulsed with movement, with rhythm, with voices asking bold questions, and fingers soldering bold ideas. It had become something more than a garage, more than a classroom. It was a forge for machines, yes, but also for people who had once been told they didn't belong anywhere near greatness. Luis Alvarez arrived every morning before sunrise, not because he had to, but because the quiet hours before the buzz held something sacred. He would walk the aisles between workstations, fingertips brushing against tools as if listening to them. He'd make coffee in the corner, always enough for others. And he'd sit for a moment with his notebook open, sketching ideas he never planned to publish. Ideas that belonged only to thought, to motion, to reverence. One particular morning, as frost coated the windows and breath hung in the air like soft smoke, Arya joined him. She held a letter in her hands, creased, trembling at the edge. Luis looked up with a knowing glance. "What did they say?" She hesitated. "MIT full scholarship, autonomous systems and mechanical behavior." Luis leaned back. A slow smile broke across his weathered face. Not pride exactly, but the quiet confirmation of something long planted, finally blooming. "You knew before I did," she said. "No," he replied. "You knew. You just needed someone to believe it with you." She sank into the stool beside him. "I don't want to leave this place." Luis sipped his coffee. "You're not leaving it. You're carrying it forward. That's the point. The lab is only a home because people like you lit it from the inside." She stared at the floor, voice soft. "Will it change without me?" "It should," he said. "Everything living does. That's how we know it's still alive." A long silence passed between them. Not sorrowful, just full. Then Arya looked up. "Come with me." Luis chuckled. "I'm a bit old for dorm life." "I'm serious. Guest lectures, labs. They'd listen to you." He looked out the frostbitten window toward the skyline. "I've spent my life in the hum of engines, not lecture halls." Arya smiled. "You'd be surprised how loud your silence can be in a room full of noise." He didn't answer, but something in him softened. That same afternoon, the board at Langston Motors gathered for a quiet ceremony. No cameras, no speeches, just a table, a plaque, and a chair that had waited far too long to be offered. Luis Alvarez was named Chief Innovation Officer Emeritus. The title came with no power over people, no budget to control. Just one responsibility: to protect the company's soul. The plaque they handed him was carved from steel, engraved with his blueprint sketch from decades ago. At the bottom it read, "For listening when others spoke, and speaking only when the moment mattered." Luis ran his hand across the surface fingers, lingering on the grooves of the metal, like a pianist rediscovering a forgotten chord. Derek Langston stood beside him, not towering, not posturing, just present. "I thought being CEO meant building the future," Derek said, "but I never knew how blind I was to the people who were the future." Luis nodded gently. "Sometimes it takes breaking to hear the hum again." That evening, a company-wide gathering was held. Not a gala, not a showcase, just people in a circle beneath soft overhead lights. The fellowship students stood at the center, each of them holding something they'd built, a part, a prototype, a printout, a dream. Luis stood with them. He didn't speak for applause. He spoke because the silence was ready. "There was a time when I thought brilliance lived in silence," he began. "That if I just worked hard enough, kept my head down long enough, the world would notice." He looked around the circle. Young eyes, old eyes, the entire range of belief and recovery staring back at him. "But the truth is," he continued, "silence only works if someone else is listening, and when they're not, you speak. Not to shout, not to shame, but to remind them that machines aren't the only ones who break. People do too. And when they do, Someone has to reach down, not with pity, but with purpose. He held up a simple wrench, worn and marked by years of use. "This is still my favorite tool," he said. "Not because it's powerful, but because it requires patience, and pressure, and precision." He handed it to Sasha. "And because it only works when you feel what the bolt needs." The room stood still. Then a ripple of applause broke, not explosive, but deep, sincere, like thunder far off rolling through the bones of everyone listening. In the days that followed, Luis received letters from around the world, not from executives, but from workers. Farm mechanics, cargo haulers, bicycle repairmen in Nairobi, solar engineers in Bangladesh. People who had felt invisible now felt seen. One note read, "You reminded me I'm not just fixing machines, I'm keeping stories alive." Luis framed that one, hung it above his workbench. Beside it, he pinned a note from a 12-year-old girl who'd seen him speak at her school. "Dear Mr. Luis, I want to build cars that hug the road and people too." He kept that one closer. Because that was the future. Not speed, not steel, but care. Legacy doesn't scream. It listens. And Luis Alvarez, once fired without a word, had become the heartbeat of a company that had finally learned how to listen back. Snow fell like soft static against the workshop's high windows, muffling the city's distant clamor. Inside, heat lamps glowed amber over rows of unfinished dreams, chassis stripped to ribs, circuit boards gleaming like constellations, blueprints peppered with penciled questions. The night shift had gone home hours ago, but two figures remained, one young hair tied back beneath a knit cap, one older silver at the temple sleeves rolled past strong forearms that still bore the faint perfume of engine oil. Arya pressed the final sensor into place on the Adaptive's prototype suspension. "Moment of truth," she murmured. She tapped her tablet. Data rippled across the screen, numbers settling into velvet. Green. Balanced. Responsive. She exhaled a silent laugh, half disbelief, half gratitude, and turned to Luis. "She's ready." He didn't answer at first. His gaze wandered along the quiet rows, stopping on each workstation, as though offering a benediction. In the hush, he could almost hear the steady heartbeat of the place he'd helped remake. Then he nodded, a slow curve of pride warming his eyes. "Let's wake her gently." They rolled the vehicle onto the indoor test strip, an elongated arc of composite flooring studded with sensors. Overhead fluorescents hummed awake. Arya climbed into the driver's seat. Luis stood to the side, fingertips grazing the fender like a father's hand on a child's shoulder. She thumbed the ignition. The engine purred, a tone so soft it felt like an inhalation rather than a roar. The car eased forward, suspension flexing with uncanny grace over simulated potholes and broken asphalt plates. No jolt, no whine, no hidden rattle. On the final segment, the track tilted 20 degrees, mimicking a hillside road after heavy rain. The Adaptive adjusted in a single fluid motion, hugging the curve as though poured from water. All sensors green. Arya braked at the far wall and sat motionless, hands trembling around the wheel. Luis walked up and opened the door. "How does she feel?" Arya looked at him, eyes bright, voice hoarse. "Like she's listening." That word lingered in the chill air, settling into memory. The next morning, snow still dusted the courtyard when press vans lined the curb. Today wasn't a launch. It was a promise. The Adaptive would be demonstrated for a coalition of humanitarian agencies, NGOs, and journalists, more accustomed to field tents than red carpets. Derek greeted them in a plain charcoal coat, no entourage, no flash, while the fellowship students guided guests past open bays where engines lay in varying stages of revelation. Luis stayed in the background, arms folded, watching Sasha explain the suspension geometry to a logistics chief from Doctors Without Borders. She spoke with confidence that hadn't existed 3 months earlier, sketching load calculations on a whiteboard, while the chief nodded, eyebrows climbing in surprise. When she finished, the room erupted in gentle applause. Sasha caught Luis's eye, cheeks flushing with a pride he returned in silence. Derek stepped onto a low riser near the test strip. Cameras pivoted, microphones rose. But instead of launching into corporate bravado, he cleared his throat and gestured to Luis, who reluctantly approached. "This company once forgot what matters," Derek began. "We chased horsepower and headlines. Then a man reminded us that the greatest engine is humility. Tonight, he'll speak first." Derek stepped back. Luis faced the crowd. No lectern, no notes, just calloused hands and a quiet certainty. "Machines don't save lives," he said. "People do. But sometimes a machine can carry hope where roads are broken and help is hours away. The adaptive was built for those hours." He paused, letting the echo settle. "We've designed her to cross terrain you wouldn't send a bicycle over, to run on fuel blends you can mix in a village, and to be repaired with tools a farmer keeps in a tin box." He rested a hand on the hood. "If we've done our job, she'll arrive before despair does." A field medic raised her hand. "What about cost?" Sasha answered from the sideline. "A third of a traditional off-road ambulance. Parts are modular. If a module fails, you swap it in minutes. Diagnostics are acoustic. You can hear problems before a computer says so." The medic blinked. "Acoustic?" Luis smiled. "Some things technology forgets. We remembered." After the Q&A, Arya drove the adaptive through a gauntlet of obstacles, jagged concrete chunks, simulated flood trenches, slick ice patches sprayed by hidden nozzles. The vehicle glided, dipped, and rose like a dancer refusing to misstep. Gasps turned to cheers. Cameras clicked like hail on a tin roof, and somewhere in that radiant uproar, Luis felt a quiet click inside his chest, a bolt settling a story, completing its thread. That evening, while contracts were drafted and logistics teams mapped deployment schedules, Luis slipped outside into the snow-soft night. He walked the perimeter of the building, listening to the muffled hum of HVAC vents, the occasional rattle of a distant bus, the crisp chorus of winter stars overhead. Footsteps crunched behind him. It was Derek Breath pluming in the cold. "They're calling it the Alvarez suspension now," he said, voice half wonder, half question. "I didn't approve the name. The engineers insisted." Luis shrugged. "Names don't make a machine remember what it was built for." Derek looked at him, snow catching in his hair like fleeting silver. "I'm leaving the CEO post at the end of the quarter." Luis turned surprise, flickering across his face. "My tenure began with noise," Derek continued. "It should end in quiet. The board will announce a successor soon, someone who understands that profit without purpose rusts faster than scrap." He exhaled vapor, ghosting between them. "I owe that lesson to you." Luis's voice was gentle. "Lessons only stick when we teach ourselves." Derek managed a crooked smile. "Then consider me your slowest student." They stood there shoulder to shoulder, watching the snow erase their footprints almost as soon as they formed, a reminder that the ground is always ready for new stories. Weeks later, Luis boarded a train heading north to Cambridge. He carried a small duffel, his leather journal, and a wrench polished clean but scarred with stories. MIT's guest lecture hall buzzed with expectancy as students filled the tiered seats, some clutching magazines with his face on the cover, others scribbling equations they hoped he'd solve on stage. When he stepped to the podium, uncomfortable in a blazer Arya had insisted he borrow, he waited for the clamor to settle. Then he reached into the duffel, pulled out the battered wrench, and set it on the lectern with a resonant clang. The hall stilled. "I was invited to talk about the future of engineering," he began, voice low yet unmistakable. "But the future started whispering decades before you were born, and it still speaks a language we almost forgot." He tapped the wrench. "This is the first translator." He spoke for 40 minutes about rhythm humility, the communion between instinct and data. He told them the story of a flaw hidden beneath glossy paint of a junior assistant who chose courage of a company rediscovering its pulse. He ended with no crescendo, no grand challenge, only an invitation. "When you leave this room, listen. To the machines, yes,
but also to the people who stand quietly beside them. Genius is often a whisper waiting for a moment of grace. The standing ovation lasted long after he'd shuffled backstage, cheeks warm with quiet embarrassment. A professor caught up to him. "Mr.
Alvarez, would you consider teaching a seminar next spring?" Luis thought of the fellowship students of Aria preparing to depart for the very halls where he now stood of Sasha, bent over torque specs of the medic in Sudan, who had already requested 10 adaptives. His smile deepened with the knowledge that legacy doesn't bind, it branches. "I'll come for 1 week," he said, "but only if the lab doors stay open all night." Back at Langston Motors, the adaptive rolled off production line 0 and onto a cargo plane bound for the Andes chassis, still bearing fingerprints in primer gray. Reporters wanted photos of Luis waving it goodbye. He declined. Instead, he stood in the hangar corner, hands in pockets, whispering a blessing beneath the roar of jet engines. Months passed. Snow yielded to rain, then to the soft exhale of spring. A video arrived in Luis's inbox from a village high in the Peruvian mountains, children chasing the adaptive as it rumbled over rock-strewn paths, a midwife stepping out with fresh medical supplies, a shepherd kissing the hood in disbelief. The camera panned inside, dashboard dusty sensors blinking steady, and caught a handwritten message taped beside the steering wheel. "Machines remember, so should we." Luis watched, chest-tight eyes misting, and understood that an engine's hum can echo across continents when carried by human hands. On a quiet Friday evening, he locked up the lab lights, off tools, resting future breathing softly in dim corners. He took one last walk down the main corridor. Photographs lined the wall, now the first fellowship cohort in grease-smudged triumph. Aria shaking hands with her MIT advisor, Derek standing beside the framed blueprint eyes brighter than any share price spike could have made them. At the end of the hallway, a mirror caught Luis's reflection. Still weathered, still steady, but carrying something new, the light of stories he'd helped ignite rather than just endure. He reached the door, paused, and turned back to the sleeping workshop. "Listen," he whispered. The silence answered, full, alive, ready. Luis stepped into the night. The door clicked shut. Somewhere far off, an engine turned over its note, clear and unwavering, beneath the vast, attentive sky. Sometimes the world forgets that the quietest hands carry the loudest wisdom. Luis Alvarez was fired not for failing, but for being overlooked. In a society obsessed with titles, speed, and prestige, it's easy to dismiss the ones who don't shout, the ones who don't wear power on their sleeves. But this story reminds us brilliance doesn't always come from the top floor. Sometimes it comes from a pair of grease-stained palms and a mind tuned to hear what machines and people are trying to say. Luis didn't seek revenge. He sought restoration. And in doing so, he built something greater than an engine. He built trust, legacy, a path forward for the unheard. The lesson is simple but enduring. Never underestimate the ones who listen. Never silence the voices that don't match your frequency. And above all, don't confuse silence for absence. Some of the most important revolutions begin with a whisper. So when someone tells you that you're just a mechanic, just a janitor, just a beginner, remember Luis? And let your work speak in ways your words never had to, because the truth doesn't need to scream to be unforgettable.